Good morning. It's Wednesday and it's time for another Business Analysis Live. I'm Susan Moore. I'm the Community Engagement Manager at the International Institute of Business Analysis. We're talking about prioritization today. Maybe you've done it. Maybe you've used MoSCoW. That was in our title for today, and we were being a little bit cheeky when we came up with that title, MoSCoW or Bust: Myths About Prioritization. I'm bringing in an expert to talk about prioritization today. He's got some experience with that. First, I want to remind you guys that we are live and we love it. Not only when you ask us questions, because we're going to be taking some questions today, but also we love it when you drop in some comments. So let's pull this up. Don't forget to ask your comments. So, who's my guest today? He is a speaker, an author, and a practitioner. So, here he is, Kent McDonald. Hey, Kent.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going well. Thank you so much for joining us today.
hmm
Um, why don't you just introduce yourself?
Sure. The quick lowdown is I'm a freelance product manager and writer. Used to be I'm a recovering agile coach. Have spent several years doing business analysis and still do that in my current guise. So I work with teams doing product management and also write about it quite a bit.
Yeah, and these are, I think, some really great articles that you write. I know that you, in the comments for the event, you actually shared one of the articles that you've written on this, and you've got a newsletter that people can also sign up for because you really talk very broadly about kind of the intersection of agile and product management and business analysis and all of those things. So, um, if you are interested in that, you should connect with Kent and sign up. All right. Well, today we're going to be talking about prioritization, and I think people sometimes get this wrong. So maybe we start with kind of what do we get wrong about prioritization when we are thinking about doing that?
There's a few things. One of them is that I'm trying to figure out when in the English language priority became plural. My understanding is that priority was always intended to mean the most important thing. So I like to think of prioritization as deciding what are we going to do and what are we not going to do, which then sets up other types of decisions as far as what order are we going to do the things that we said we were going to do in. But what a lot of people end up doing with prioritization is just saying, oh, well, we're going to move things around to different buckets and somehow still try to do everything, even though we all realize we can't get it all done.
I know before we started talking today, you and I were kind of talking about some agile stuff. And I think if we want to unpack a little bit of what you've just said there about creating big list of things that we may or may not do, you and I were talking about this idea of here, let's see. I'm going to pull up a banner here. Filters, not buckets.
Mm-hmm.
That when you're thinking about how to prioritize, the best or a good approach, maybe it's not the best, but a good approach could be thinking about those priorities as a filter. So maybe talk about that a little bit. What do you mean by a filter?
Yep. So I mentioned before that I've had more experience than I care to admit working on software product projects, mostly inside organizations, insurance, financial services, agriculture, you name it. I've probably touched it at one point or another. And often, and a few times in there, I've had the opportunity to witness, maybe even be a part of kind of an annual IT planning exercise where different business units are encouraged to say, hey, let us know what things you're needing to work on the next year. And we'll go through a prioritization exercise to determine what you're going to do. And what that ended up being is a bunch of people trying to give justification why their particular pet project should be one of the things that gets funded. And usually what folks have as a guideline or basis to suggest things is there's a set of corporate, again, with the plural priorities. So it might be 3 or 4 things that the organization wants to focus on. And what inevitably happens is that each of the different business unit sponsors, the people that are actually suggesting these efforts, will go through and say, well, this particular effort is related to this particular priority, and it touches a bit on this priority, and it also has this priority involved. So 3 out of the 5, it's got to be good. So we got to do it. And what ends up happening is you don't actually get any useful information to determine what are we actually not going to do out of that. It's just a matter of everyone's trying to justify why their initiative should be included on the list of things that aren't going to get done because the IT staff is overburdened. So the idea of using filters, not buckets, is to say, instead say, if this initiative does not actually further one of these priorities, assuming those priorities are well structured, we're not going to do it. We're just going to say, doesn't fit this year, can't do it. We need to work on these particular things. Unfortunately, most IT organizations have built themselves up not being able to say no.
Yes. This is true. Yeah, so there's a couple of things there that I'm thinking of. So you talked about prioritization is having that there could be multiple priorities of the same level. That's kind of an important thing because I think that is probably the space that a lot of us work in.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the techniques that sometimes get used, I don't think this is a real technique, but HIPPO, the highest paid person's opinion. Sometimes that is how you cut through on what gets done when you've got all those multiple competing priorities. Um, yeah, the other thing that you said there is priorities are really, we should be making decisions about what we're going to do and what we're not going to do. And I often think people think that priorities are the order in which we're going to do something. So I know in the article that you wrote, you talked about sequencing versus prioritizing, two different things. In
Mm-hmm.
sequencing, we are we are kind of ranking those things. Um, but I'm really interested in this idea of kind of making the point. Prioritizing is about decision making. Maybe talk further about that.
Sure. And to explain that, I'm going to refer back to probably the one big effort that kind of helped crystallize a lot of these things. It was in the before times, so pre-pandemic. I was working with a team that we were brought in to rebuild. And so for some of you that have been in IT for a while, what I'm going to mention now might make you squirm a little bit. We were going to rebuild a 20-year-old app that this company used to price. It was an agriculture company, so they used it to determine prices that they were going to offer to farmers to buy their seeds. And this old tool was built on Power Builder. And so our charge was to rebuild it in a more modern technology, so make it web enabled. And so what we did, approach we took is first of all, we wanted to get an understanding what the current process was, what the current data needs were, what those rules were involved as far as setting those prices. So we obviously we're going to use the existing system as a basis for that. But one of the first things we did is after kind of doing some investigation and doing some discovery sessions to figure all that out. We also made sure we clarified what was it that why we were actually doing this project. And there was more to it than just making it a more modern system. What the unspoken reason we were doing it is we needed to take some steps to make sure that the price setting calculation was freer from error than it was currently. This was never explicitly stated, but that was definitely one of the things we were trying to do. So the way we approached it is we first did a prioritization exercise. So priority is not only just deciding what big initiatives is an organization going to do or not, it's also what capabilities or features inside a particular initiative are you going to actually deliver. So the first thing we did is based on our understanding of how the process went today, we had to walk through and say, okay, what are the aspects of things that we're going to still do? What capabilities does the system need to have? And one of the other things I should mention is that we are kind of working under a specific set timeline to get the first version of this out, which just happened to be April 1st of 2020. So the first thing was a priority of basically saying what needs to be in and out by that drop dead date. So that's kind of the prioritization decision. And then once we had the stuff that was in, we then went through a sequencing exercise, which we revisited throughout the way to say, what order should we be doing these things in? And that we determined that order somewhat based on business needs, but it was also based on some technical needs as far as where there's some risks we needed to address, where there's some assumptions we needed to verify or invalidate, to make sure that our entire overall solution would work. And so that's where when we start breaking things down, we sequence them to say, let's get the riskiest stuff out of the way, which in our case happened to be an interface with the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. Mm-hmm. And were there any assumptions that we needed to verify to make sure that we were not putting in jeopardy the rest of our solution?
I'm gonna pull this banner back up because this is really interesting. It's in that example that you shared, those two things, prioritizing and sequencing, they were both important activities. Mm-hmm. The prioritizing what you are and aren't going to do, and the sequencing of the things you are going to do, the order you're going to do them in. So, and what I really want to underscore for our listeners today is the amount of analysis that had to go into both of those activities. Because very often, you and I, we were kind of sharing some stories from how we have seen, backlog, this backlog selection process work. And I told you about a time when I was in the room for something like an auction style. Hey, I have 25 hours. You get some hours, and you get some hours, and you get some hours. But really smart organizations, I think, understand that we do need to think about what we need to do and what we don't need to do, and sequencing. And if you're just walking into a room and picking from a list, you are likely not really helping the organization to achieve whatever its objectives are. So analysis is really important to those inputs. And I want to ask you about something else that you said, because it sounded like in that example, the organization had said we need to modernize our system. But when you guys really started to ask, wait, why are we doing this project? Something that was probably even more critical became important. And was there concerns about asking those kinds of questions? I mean, the leadership of your company said we got to modernize the system. Why wasn't that enough?
So one of the ways we found it out, there was a couple ways we found it out. One is I wanted to, as all good outcome focused people should, wanted to have a good measurement that we could use to say, are we making the right decisions about what we're including or not? So how are we going to measure the success of this? It's not based on delivering features by a certain time. I mean, that certainly was a important part of it, but it was really like, how do we know we're actually being successful? And I was never quite able to, and I was and actually the entire team was consultants coming into the organization. So we were never quite able to get the individual who was kind of the sponsor of it, although his title was product owner, but he was basically just there to do the high level decisions and not much more than that, because he had his normal job, to actually establish any meaningful business focused metrics. And if I were to look back, and one of the things I regret is not pushing that further. Also, in retrospect, and we realized this from working with the people that use the existing system would be using the new one. One of the main criteria would be is that one of the particular users had a tendency to fat finger things. And so if you make a decimal point error based on the price per bushel of corn, it doesn't seem like that much. But when you multiply it over thousands of bushels, it starts to add up to some real money. Yeah. And so had I do it all over again, one of the things we might have started tracking is could we have some metric that looks at the error rate or error avoidance rate or something along those lines to understand, are we doing things that are actually helping to prevent errors from happening going forward? And certainly automating the receipt of daily price levels from the Chicago Mercantile Exchange and grain elevators was going to go a long way to avoiding errors versus having someone call up grain elevators and ask for prices on a daily basis.
I see. So this, I think, is what you're referring to. This was a point that you made in that article. So start with an outcome, not a list. Does that
Mhm.
does that track? Yeah, which is maybe not a way that we think about prioritizing. Where do we want to get to? Not just work from a list of things.
And where this happens is that and I've been around teams adopting Agile again longer than I care to admit, but some of the earliest guidance for teams starting on Agile is the first step is to create a list of things you want to do, and then go through a prioritization exercise. The trouble is that that approach, doing it in that order, tends to lead to some dysfunction because people get enamored with some of the ideas they put on the list and think we couldn't possibly take it off. So when I say things like burn the backlog, they get all up in arms. And so the start with an outcome is basically saying start with understanding what it is you're trying to accomplish, and then generate things that need to happen such that you're only identifying things that would obviously help you progress towards getting that outcome. The result is you end up with a lot fewer backlog items, and the ones you do end up getting are probably more related. And you still got to accept that you're still probably not going to even do all of those, because what seems like a good idea at the beginning becomes less of a good idea once you learn more about it. So it's actually a way to keep the list of things you're doing a little bit more manageable, and starting with the end result you're trying to do, and use that as an initial filter to even come up with things to begin with.
Ah, so start with thinking about your outcomes. Use that as your filter for the things. Yeah, I've been on that project where it was like, hey, all business teams, send us your list of things you want to do, and you end up getting basically like, the basement or the garage full of junk that somebody wants to keep but doesn't actually want to make any decisions about. And you're
Yep.
right. I know, raise your hand if you are in the audience and you've got a backlog with items that are 5, 10 years old, or maybe just for funsies. What is the age of the oldest item in your backlog that people will not get rid of? Right? They won't get rid of that item. I'm curious. What are those things hanging around? Um, so so you're going to be so just to kind of take a step to the left here, you're going to be speaking at BBC, and actually all of these threads that are coming up in our conversation today are some of the topics you're going to be
Mm-hmm.
talking about. So actually one of the sessions you're going to be doing is called filters not buckets.
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to be talking about that approach to um, prioritization. You're going to be talking about backlog refinement. That'll take into account some of what we're talking about here. And also, business analysts are product people too.
Mm-hmm.
And clearly, what we're talking about here, whether you've got the title of business analyst or product owner or product manager, business analysis is playing a really important role in helping our organizations decide what to do and what not to do. So, um, so if you're going to BBC, go talk to Kent. He's got 3 different angles on this. Um, One of the things that you mentioned before we went live today was that you probably don't need a framework. Now, MoSCoW is a technique.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we can also talk about some other kinds of prioritization techniques. But what did you mean by you don't need a framework for
So
prioritization?
there are an innumerable, it seems like, list of frameworks that people swear by for prioritization, and this might be something that happens more so in the product management world, maybe more so than in the business analysis world. because I don't remember really seeing a lot of them until I got really embedded into product management. So apart from, of course, MoSCoW is one that folks recognize and stuff, but things like rice or ice, or not the current ice that's in the news, but and both of those are premised on, and a lot of these are premised on some kind of scorecard thing where you have a list of features and you go through each one and you assign scores to each of those features, and then use some kind of um, complicated yet simple math to get an overall score to determine which one we should do and what thing. So this is a case where the frameworks that are called prioritization frameworks are actually being used for sequencing purposes.
Okay.
And then the other thing, the thing I don't like about most of these is that they are providing a false sense of objectivity.
Yes.
Because in effect, each of the characteristics that you're measuring on, you're doing it from a subjective basis. So I generally don't use any of those, and I'm gonna mention an exception here in a minute, but I generally don't use any of those because I found going the approach of saying, let's understand what we're trying to do first, and then building the list based on that is a lot more effective and a lot more efficient than just collecting a bunch of things and then running it through this process. There is one technique I do use, and it's actually more of a sequencing thing than it is a prioritization thing. And I'm going to explain it, and people are going to say, well, that's just MoSCoW, but it's not exactly. And I learned this from my friend Todd Little, who's used it quite a bit, and I've used it as well. In fact, I used it on the project that I mentioned, and it's where you take the items that you're going to do, and assuming you've already kind of gone through and say, yeah, we're not going to do these, we're going to do these. And then you say, I'm going to group them into A, B, and C. A are the things that you absolutely have to have. So this is where people are going to say, well, this is just MoSCoW. The trick is that you have a limit to how many items you can put in there. And I believe, if I remember correctly, it's been a little bit since I've used it. The premise is you basically can only put enough items in that A bucket, so the must-have the things you got to have done to get that outcome, that fill up 50% of your capacity. So if you say we're going to plan out the next quarter of work, you can only put in enough items that you think, and again, these are estimates, so you're going to be completely wrong anyway, but based on what you understand at that time, these are the number of items we can get done in half of a quarter. And the reason you do the 50% is because stuff happens, and there's a good likelihood that the things that you thought you'd be able to get 50% done is going to end up expanding to take up the entire quarter. But if that doesn't happen, then the items in B these would be the nice things to have that if we have a little bit of time, we're going to do them, but they're not essential. And then the C items, like, yeah, we probably won't be able to get to these anyway. So it's kind of an ABC approach to estimating. It's different from MoSCoW because you're actually putting limits on how many things you can put in the bucket. Because I don't know if your experience is anything similar to mine, but a lot of people, when they do MoSCoW, everything tends to be weighted in the M. Everything's a must-have.
Yeah, it sounds almost like MoSCoW plus maybe like kind of a Kanban approach, right? So I'm saying you can only put so many things into this bucket, and that's it. And yeah, how how much of prioritization do you think or the ways that organizations prioritize is custom to the way that they work or the culture of the organization? Do you find that it is more tailored to organizations, or do you find that everybody kind of prioritizes the same way?
I am one of the other big things I'm a huge believer in is the power of context. So not only is prioritization, sequencing, decision making dependent on how organizations work, it's even dependent on what type of product you're working on. So
Mhm.
the article I dropped in the comments for the announcement for this is actually kind of an intro article to a series of articles that go into a bunch of different cases about here's how things people prioritize when they're building a completely new product. Here's how people prioritize when they're enhancing an existing product, because the schemes you use that I found to be more effective are different depending on the nature of that product. So yeah, it depends.
Okay.
Had
And
to
I
throw
think,
in the depends in there somewhere.
well, you wouldn't be a good consultant if you didn't remind us of that. Actually, a good business analyst will remind people. It depends. It depends. All right. Well, I tell you what, why don't we take a couple of questions here? I've seen we've got a lot of folks in the house. Also, that question that I asked the group, like tell us how old the oldest thing is in your backlog. So here Bargov says 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
Gabriella says 4 years. Here we go. Ginger says back from 2021. Oh, and here's speaking about kind of the rationalizations we use for keeping things in the backlog that we think we're going to get around to. The innovation debt makes it sound really nice, but it's just something that we probably aren't going to get around to. So,
Yeah.
so, so thanks for that. Okay, let's see. Let's get over here to some questions. Here we go. So this first question is from Gabriella. Any tips for helping stakeholders decide which things are more important than others? I mean, what can be done when stakeholders can't precisely say what is important to them? Yeah.
I'm going to, I've been there, trust me.
Yeah, same.
I'm going to start with the snarky answer, and then hopefully come around to a more helpful one. I have been in positions before, and again, one of the problems that a lot of people, especially business analysts that are working in kind of more of an IT setting, run into is that those organizations fund their efforts on a project model. Kind of, I was describing before, we got a bucket of money, you got to go to the auction and got to convince people that your pet project is the right thing to do this year. Without having a really good understanding as far as why it's more important as it relates to your business unit and to the organization overall compared to all the other ones. And so then it does become a lot harder to convince the stakeholders. My snarky response was going to be, is if your stakeholders can't express what's important to them, say, well, we must not need to do any changes to your system this year. See you later, which may not win you any friends. So it really, it does come back to, and this is starting to become a little bit of an overused phrase, but it really is getting back to why are you suggesting this? What is it you're trying to accomplish? And then understand how is that and why is that important to the organization? And if you're able to work back and say, what are we trying to accomplish here? You may find that you're able to get to that point with a lot less effort than the solution in the form of a project that your sponsor is suggesting, which is also what usually happens.
Yeah, the old what is the problem we're trying to solve? I sometimes asking that question can just unlock people's minds a little bit because they're already at this is the thing that I need. And if you can
Mm-hmm.
take them back a couple of steps and they describe it, you can just be that person that says, okay, here's what I'm hearing you say. When I look across, like whatever the organizational priorities are, and so you can help them to map that. Um, all right. So let's see. We've got another question here. I like the concept of decision rhythm, drumbeat of Q&A. The A is different from project to project, but the Q are highly similar and reflect recent lessons learned. Hmm. Have you heard of this?
I'm gonna take it in a little bit different
Okay.
angle. What I think LinkedIn user is suggesting here. To me, this has the feeling of the concept of jobs to be done, which is again, it's another it's a trendy approach to understanding what outcomes you're trying to get to, and it's also a great source for guidance on how to do effective interviews, because what you're really doing is you're going into your when you're doing discovery work, you're going in to understand and asking people to talk about their experiences and their what they've actually done, as opposed to asking them to try and predict the future. But one of the premises of jobs to be done is that people are trying to get something accomplished, and they hire products to help them get those things done. The jobs themselves don't generally change over time, but the means of accomplishing them do. So how that applies if you're in an internal product situation is all organizations have certain business processes that they got to run. They got to pay their people. They got to produce a product. They got to sell the product. They got to fulfill the product. They got to get raw materials, all that kind of things. Those jobs don't tend to change. How they can approach them can change. So if you're able to kind of walk it back and say, let's understand what is it we're trying to accomplish, which part of the overall organization are we trying to accomplish here? What's not working with the way we're doing it right now? And then you can maybe then identify what's a better way to do that. As opposed to someone who's embedded in a particular way of doing things and says something's not working, so here's what I think you should do, and they're coming from a position where this is the solution I am familiar with, so obviously just need to change this, as opposed to working with the people that might know the overall capabilities of things to suggest something different.
I think one of the most difficult things that business analysis professionals have to do is we have to have those delicate conversations where somebody is convinced with their current view of how things are working or their current understanding of their systems department or whatever, um, that we have to ask them additional questions, questions that might take them upstream a few steps of where they are. And I think for some folks that can feel like I shouldn't ask them questions. This person has a job title which is, 5 grades higher than me. They're coming into the room knowing exactly what they want. I haven't found that to be true the majority of the time. And so I think sometimes our inability to just ask those questions can sometimes lead us to projects that don't result in the
Mhm.
outcomes we want. So,
And the secret there is not subjecting them to some form of Spanish Inquisition, right? When you're doing it, there are ways of asking the questions that you're positioning it as I'm just trying to understand, as opposed to you're an idiot, you don't understand anything what's going on here. That's not the route you want to go. Um, and it's a way of positioning it such that I'm trying to understand, what we're trying to accomplish here so that we can make sure we can get it done as quickly as possible. So then maybe we can get to the 75 other things that we won't get to if we do what you're asking us to. Again, you wouldn't say that either, but that's kind of what you're implying is we need to come up with how can we most effectively address what you're trying to solve so we can get more of those problems solved.
there's this series of TikTok videos that I'm hearing about where people are taking something they really want to say and then they do it in corporate speak,
Mhm.
um, and it's sort of hilarious, but also it's got some great points. So if anybody knows about those TikTok videos I'm referring to, take a peek at those. There is a little bit of a diplomatic game that you have to play there, and I think we inadvertently kind of answered Igioma's question because she was saying how best can we convince stakeholders on the analysis of MoSCoW or whatever the prioritization technique is. I think to your point, it is like we don't need to hit them hard with the 5 whys. We don't need to literally ask why 5 times. We can simply have that conversation because it will require some influence. It will require some aha moments on their part. It might require some storytelling, like to get them into the mindset that we need them to get into. Let's see. All right. We've got, let's see, here we go. Um, use the active based decomposition to identify work that is done, value add, supportive, in diversionary. So this, I think, sounds like kind of version of a MoSCoW, where we are thinking we're finding buckets. Is that how you would interpret this?
Yeah, and another thing here, I'm going to use this as an opportunity to talk a little bit more about how I've gone the route of using backlogs these days. And again, if you come to BBC and come to that session, you'll hear more about it. But I actually have started keeping a separate list when I receive requests or suggestions or feedback. And an important thing I've learned is that stakeholder requests are not requirements, they're feedback. Meaning you don't have to do everything that people ask you to do, unless, of course, there's some power issues involved in your organization and you have to tread a little bit lightly. But what it really is a matter of saying is all of that information is coming in as input to help you say, where are the indicators that there's some really problems going on? And then your backlog are actually the things that make the cut between that prioritization filter that says, based on all this feedback, these are the things that we know we need to tackle because they're more addressed to our outcome. One of the other things is, and this was kind of what we were getting at in the Agile extension to the BA-BOK when we created the decision levels or decision horizons. I can't remember what exact term we
Yes.
call them.
Yeah, the horizons, you're right.
Is that there are decisions going on at each of those levels of detail. And so, and like the story about the pricing tool that I mentioned earlier, we made some high level prioritization decisions about this is in, this is out. We sequenced that, and then we sequenced those things we sequenced were pretty large chunks, and then we broke them. We took the ones that we were going to be doing next, broke those down into smaller details, and did the same thing. There were some parts of that broken down aspect. We said, you know what, now that we get into this and understand a little bit better, these things we don't need to do. We need to order these other things. So this is a constantly revising cycle and further detail. As you get in more into it, learn more about it, get a better understanding about it, that you can really hone in on these are the things we need to do here.
I'm glad you brought up the horizons. That for me is like one of the really great things that gets introduced in that Agile extension, because I know that my Agile experience had been that I was working across different kinds of horizons. I didn't know that we had a name for them until I read that, but it made perfect sense. So what I hear you say is that we might be making prioritization decisions about big things, but that's not where it ends.
Mm-hmm.
As we get from the strategy to the what is the next one? Delivery and initiative? I think
Initiative and
those
then
are.
delivery.
Oh, okay, I had it backwards. So
Yeah.
then you're going to make a different set about the
Mm-hmm.
initiative, and then a more timely decision about the things that you're going to do at the delivery level. Um, so yeah, prioritization actually it doesn't really end, I think. All right. So let's see. Let's take another question here. This one is also from LinkedIn user. Sometimes we can't the names don't pull over into StreamYard. So I believe organizations should pursue and synchronize as many projects down to marginal profit equals zero, since pivoting on projects has low heartburn. But I believe most companies under innovate, disguised as lean. Hmm. I I mean, I worry about pursue as many projects as possible.
Yeah, I've seen this happen, and again, my my perspective is probably a little biased because I would suggest that organizations should move away from project-based funding. But I think this is might be a symptom of, again, the implementers don't feel like they're in a position to say no.
Oh, okay.
So when it's the planning time, the path of least resistance seems to be is yes, we'll do these, forgetting that down the road they're going to have the often difficult conversation about why they didn't get all the things they said they were going to do at the beginning of the year done. Um, so again, it really is important at the beginning to set expectations properly, saying, understand you're asking for a lot of these things. It's more than we're able to do. Um, so we're going to have to decide what we are and aren't going to do. Maybe determine if we were able to get the things done that we said we're going to do earlier than we anticipated, which if we're doing fewer of them, we'll be able to focus and have a better chance of doing that, here's the next list of things we're going to do. And I would agree that a lot of companies under innovate, and it's not because, and part of it, I wouldn't say it's necessarily lean. I would say it's because they're trying to get so many things done, is that they haven't put some constraints over what they're getting throwing into the bucket to begin with, that they can focus and figure those things out. Because one way that innovation really shows up is figuring out fast, effective ways to solve problems.
Right. I am thinking about a situation that I've been in like this, and my experience was that we had so many different parts of the organization just putting things into these backlogs, in part because there was a little bit of a distrust that we were going to get things done at all. So everybody at least wanted to get them on the list to be able to say to their leaders, well, I put it on the list. I don't know why IT can't get to it. Um, and I think one of the things that we worked really hard on as a leadership team was we needed to go back and build trust, because some of that was history. Some of it was
Mhm.
we had a really ineffective way of getting projects completed. Like we would get halfway into something only to discover that we just couldn't complete it. So midway through a sprint, we would just have to throw it out because we hadn't done like the proper due diligence or asked the right questions. And they had lost trust in us. And it wasn't until we could go back and build trust properly and do what we said we were going to do, but also fix our issues, that things started to turn around so that we could have good conversations about this is our capacity and we've been delivering just like you've wanted. But if you ask us to do more than this, we can't do that anymore. So now those, I think, aren't always business analysis professional conversations, but sometimes they can be. But I think you've got to figure out what are you as an IT team doing to create some of this.
Mhm. I've often said that IT organizations have spent the last 30 years teaching business units how to be bad customers.
Yeah.
Because they've set them up with this. Yes, we're going to say we're going to do this, and then we inevitably don't. And so, yeah, there's a lack of trust.
Yeah.
So you got to rip the Band-Aid off at some point and have those difficult conversations about, look, we know we're not going to be able to get that whole list done.
Yeah.
Let's pare it down, do the things that are extremely important first, and see where we go from there.
Yeah, this is why I always say business analysis is a relationship business. And I think sometimes people think that's a kooky thing to say, but I have often uh, been surprised by when we are building really good relationships and being really honest about things we can do and not do. Um, we usually get better outcomes simply based on kind of being honest with each other.
Well,
So,
and the things you can and can't do off there's been several times where we can't solve the problem the way you're asking, but we can solve the problem.
hmm, yes, yeah. And sometimes we're afraid to say that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because it might be not a very exciting way to solve it or the thing that's in that business person's mind. Yeah. So it does. It takes some skillful conversations. And so I think that's why, I'm sad I'm not going to be at BBC because I love all of these topics, but I especially love business analyst or product people too. Because I sometimes think that business analysts think of themselves as separate, but what we've talked about today, business analysis skills and business analysis professionals, I think, are deeply, deeply necessary to good decision making and prioritization in organizations. So, all right. Well, we've this has been a great conversation. I know you and I have already talked about like let's come back and talk about some more stuff. So we'll be seeing you again, Kent. And if I don't see you again before BBC, best of luck. And for those of you that are going to be at BBC, make sure you show up for his session. So thanks
All
so
right.
much. Yeah,
Thank you
for
very much.
yeah. All right. And I want to thank you guys for joining us today. Hopefully, you've gotten some good nuggets here about prioritizations it's more than just MoSCoW. There's lots of ways, and hopefully you understand now, like, what are the things that you want to achieve with prioritizing. So we will be back in 2 weeks from today, right here, and we will see you soon. Bye.